Welcome, everyone, to our 39 Plus podcast. The point of this podcast is to explore the halachic considerations for observant healthcare professionals. We're really excited to, do this project in conjunction with our written work. So for those of you who don't know, we have our written guide on our website. A link will be put in the description below. Or you can just visit our website under resources, Clinicians Guide for Shabbos, where we outline chapter by chapter various malachos that you'll come across while working in the hospital on Shabbos and the various solutions to think about. Now, none of it is really something that you can poskin off of, but the idea is that you'll get enough information to really know what the sugya is really all about, and then you can take that information and bring that to your posik and ask the appropriate questions. And so in this series, we're going to do video by video, kind of similar to each chapter. So for example, we have one chapter on Kosev, on writing. And so today's video will be also focused on the same halacha of Kosev.
And before we start, a special thank you to Rabbi Sprung for being a great mentor, guide, general supporter. He really helped us reviewing this topic, and he even took the painstaking time to really edit the booklet line by line. And on a personal level, I'm very, very grateful that he took the time to do that. Lastly, we'd like to thank Summit Health Center for sponsoring the sample and providing the Jewish physicians all over the world the chance and the platform to excel both professionally and in their Torah study. In this episode, we're going to be diving into the topic of medical documentation and note-taking on Shabbos. As clinicians, the accuracy of our medical records is crucial for patient safety, but writing on Shabbos normally violates the halacha of Kosev and would therefore be forbidden. So we'll be discussing a number of methods for keeping medical records on Shabbos without violating the halacha of Kosev, and we'll also discuss which contexts one would be allowed to write even normally. We'll cover 4 options, such as using a shinoi, using writing in a non-normative fashion, using disappearing ink, using electronic tablets or regular EMRs, computers, printer, and we'll also go over how to, the status of a printer on Shabbos. We'll also be proposing a practical algorithm where we'll try to break down the different options into first, second, third, and fourth line. And this is going to apply for physicians and all healthcare workers who find themselves working on Shabbos in a hospital setting.
So just a little bit of background. We had actually done a prior series going more in depth into the background of halacha and Shabbos and residency. For those who haven't seen it, first, I recommend going to see that because that will give you a lot of background for what we're talking. The point here is to be very direct and straightforward, and those concepts that we've discussed in other videos will certainly come in handy if you've already seen them. But if you haven't seen them, I just want to give a brief breakdown about some of the important things to consider when addressing a malacha that you're going to come across on Shabbos. So first is that you always want to identify, is the isser that you're doing an isser d'oraisa, a biblical prohibition, or is it isser d'rabbanan? You also want to consider who you're doing it for. So there are types of patients that we generally won't do an isser d'oraisa, and there are times where we have patients where we will. And so the context of this conversation of Kosev, we're generally talking about inpatients, and inpatients are classified as patients who are, for the most part, are usually classified as sick people whose lives are in danger. So chola sheyesh bo sakana, and so you can do more for a patient sheyesh bo sakana than you can that's she'ein bo sakana. So for example, if this wouldn't apply in an outpatient setting or to a patient whose life is not in danger. So it's just important to identify what kind of patient you're doing the isser for, and what kind of isser would be doing. And then lastly, I want to point out that once you've identified these things, regardless if you're able to navigate not doing these things or doing these things in the least possible way, that's ideal. So even if we know you're allowed to do a d'rabbanan for this type of patient, if you can do it in a way that minimizes the isser, you would still be expected to minimize the isser. So those are just some background points I think are really important to consider before even having this discussion.
Our first option, using a shinoi, or using one's non-dominant hand. On Shabbos, it's not that work, the way we phrase it in English, is prohibited, but it's a specific class of work that's halachically defined as malacha, and that malacha is really what's prohibited on Shabbos. We have a tradition that malacha refers to the activities which were necessary for the construction of the Mishkan. One of the malachas that was done in the Mishkan that was necessary for the construction of the Mishkan was ksiva, writing. So ksiva in the Mishkan doesn't specifically have to be ink on paper. Using a rubber stamp or chiseling a chart into stone, like charting is done in some of the community hospitals that we rotate at, would all technically constitute Kosev. It's important caveat for this, though, is that writing in a non-normative way, that's to say, writing in a way, with the wrong hand, writing simply wasn't done that way in the Mishkan, and therefore it wouldn't be considered Melachas Mal Shabbos. So that would mean that if you're a right-handed person writing with your left hand on Shabbos, or if you're a left-handed person writing with your right hand on Shabbos, on a biblical level, from a derisive perspective, that would be considered a non-normative way to do the Malacha, and therefore it would be more ideal to do it, in that sort of way. Because that technically would only be Asur D'Rabbanan, and for these patients, as we said before, an Asur D'Rabbanan is well within what's allowed.
Right. So just to recap, the malacha of ksiva is done when it's in its normative way. So if you're doing it in a non-normative way, that brings down the level of Isser to D'Rabbanan. So if you're normally right-handed, you do it with your left hand. You've now done the writing in a non-normative way. You've brought down the level of Isser to a D'Rabbanan. And so therefore, like when you're taking care of patients in an inpatient setting, if you're writing notes, and it's not going to affect patient care, because that's always something that we have to consider. It's not going to meaningfully impact the patient, something that you can get away doing. Writing with your non-dominant hand would be preferable, because this is what we call a shinoi, and this brings down the level of Isser to a D'Rabbanan. And I want to point out that using a shinoi takes many different forms depending on what malacha you're doing. So for most people, if you're a right-handed person, writing is pretty difficult with your left hand. And so this is considered a shinoi. This is something that's not the normative way, and it actually very much impacts what you're doing. If you're carrying something, which is its own Isser, and you carry it in your left hand versus even though you would normally in your right, that would not generally be accepted as a shina for that type of malacha. So I just want to point that out as well, that this is specific to this malacha, and it brings down the level of Isser. And so it's preferable to use your non-dominant hand when it doesn't meaningfully impact the patient.
Yeah, the reverse would also be true. So if using your non-dominant hand or using any of the other methods here would impact patient care and safety, halacha would not demand that you do it. And instead, halacha, being that preservation of life is overriding moral principle in Judaism, halacha would actually demand that you do the malacha in its normative way. And that brings us to our second option: disappearing or impermanent ink. So impermanent ink, in Hebrew ksav she'eino miskayim, also doesn't violate a biblical malacha. This would also be considered a non-normative way, and a malacha that would be meaningfully different from the way it was done in the Mishkan. Therefore, keeping medical records using impermanent ink or inscribing them on something that wouldn't last on Shabbos should be permissible for the medical needs of patients that, obviously, being inpatients, are considered cholim, for which malachas d'Rabbanan are largely permissible. And it's definitely more preferable than doing it in a normal biblical way, right? So it's definitely in the spirit of minimizing the Isser. The poskim debate how long the legal status of impermanent is in the context of Hilchos Shabbos. On the one hand, it's intuitive that writing doesn't have to literally last forever to be considered permanent. So we're not expecting all writing in a certain time horizon would eventually disappear, or the medium itself would be destroyed. So what exactly is the time scale that halacha would consider a meaningful malacha and a biblical malacha? So Rabbi Salman Auerbach posited that one's only liable for Kosev if the writing lasts for several days. Rabbi Yaakov Weiss, in his work the Minchas Yitzchak, disagrees and rules that permanence of writing is defined as lasting throughout the Shabbos in question. So he explains that writing is considered permanent, or malacha in general is considered permanent, if the malacha in question lasts until the end of that Shabbos. On a practical basis, most contemporary authorities view the opinion of Shimon Zalman that one would only be liable for Kosev if the ksav lasts for several days as accepted psak.
So just to recap, in a similar fashion, the way when you used your left hand, you were doing ksiva, but it was in a non-normative way, and therefore brought down the level of Isser to a D'Rabbanan. Doing a ksiva that doesn't last is also a ksiva in its non-normative way, and also brings down the level to D'Rabbanan. And so therefore, if you're on morning rounds where you have to, or often have to, write by hand with a pen, you have the option of using your left hand, or you have the option of ink that doesn't last. So an example of this is actually these ear erasing pens. And again, like a link to this is found on our website in the Clinician's Guide to Shabbos, but also we'll provide a link in the description of this video where you can buy it locally on Amazon. And the great thing about this pen is that it will last long enough for the end of morning rounds where you finally do get to a computer and have to put in patient notes. But it also disappears enough to technically to be considered a ksiva that doesn't last. And this pen has been approved by Rabbi Sprung, so we're in good company for using this pen to minimize the isser of when you're forced to really write your notes, like on morning rounds.
So the third option, and probably an option that's very, very relevant, especially after those morning rounds, after you've taken down your task lists. So that would be writing on an electronic tablet, or in general, using an EMR to write digital records. Poskim for the previous generation wrestled with really how to model electricity on Shabbos extensively. And depending on the pasuk, the use of electricity on Shabbos can be categorized as a violation of Issa Deraisa, Derabanan, or something of a minig. According to Rishon Zalman Auerbach, clinicians may be lenient considering the use of electricity on Shabbos and rely on the opinions that say that it really is modeled more like an Issa Derabanan when necessary. This is also an opinion that's widely accepted amongst modern poskim. Even Rav Asher Weiss, who posits electricity is Asur Deraisa, and he has this in landmark tshuva in his Nefesh Asher, he does poskin that it would be acceptable to rely on lenient opinions in the interest of patient care. Furthermore, as it relates to Kosev, even though digital writing can sometimes last for longer than a few days, right? You could technically have a screen on that stays on for much longer than another form of writing. It wouldn't be considered ksav or writing because it's technically an intangible digital representation of letters, making it, again, fundamentally different than the way ksav was done in the Mishkan. Bearing this in mind, and bearing in mind the Ramah's requirement that we minimize the Isser, Rav Asher Weiss has an insight to make the use of using like a keyboard or a phone even more halachically ideal. He say it would technically be preferable, according to him, to use your knuckles to try to type, or maybe practice a shina using thimbles or something of the like on the finger, something that would be meaningfully inconvenient to the point where you wouldn't do it that way during the week, but something that would still allow you to do most of it, as fluidly as possible on Shabbos. So regarding using the computer mouse on Shabbos, it would also seem logical that using one's non-dominant hand would also be considered a shinui and be slightly better. Using a computer mouse requires accuracy and precision. Is generally not done with a non-dominant hand, meaning in the week you wouldn't do it that way. So using the same sort of rationale, that would be better. It would also be better to try to use a similar methodology with smartphones or touchscreens. Either use your knuckle or use a thimble that happens to also have a conductive pad. But just as the takeaway, digital writing is a better option than the erasable temporary writing when possible. And it is also preferable to using a shine, because this is a somewhat lesser derabanan.
So just to summarize, so most poskim hold that electronic writing is considered derabanan in the context of healthcare, and therefore digital writing, even something like using your iPad and like an Apple pen, right? Digital writing, even though it looks more like tangible writing, would all kind of come under the same umbrella when it comes to halacha, and that's a better option than the erasable temporary writing, or writing in a dominant hand. And I just want to make a point of showing that in the earlier part of this video when we talked about using a shinoi, or so using your non-dominant hand or using the erasable, the pens that with the disappearing ink, we took it from a deraisa to derabanan, and here, even though we're starting off as most people agree it's derabanan, we're still implying that you should use shinoi when you can, because again, there is this obligation to minimize isser, even if you're doing derabanan for a patient that you're allowed to do derabanan. And I just want to point out that part of the reason is that not just minimizing isser to what it is, but it really, the mechanism by which that works is that it takes you out of the weekday, and it really brings to you and brings close to your heart the fact that it is Shabbos. And that's something that, just anecdotally speaking to lots of physicians, just for your own mindset, being in the hospital at Shabbos, knowing that it's a different day, going out of your way to do things differently, not just good halachically, but, halacha always kind of mirrors what's best for you just personally. And so this really helps you keep in mind it is Shabbos. This is something that you don't want to do, and this is something that if you can, you wouldn't be there on Shabbos. And I think just psychologically, that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
And our last topic, which is printing. Printing is by far the most problematic non-writing form of writing. So unlike recording data digitally, as we said before, the end product of printing directly resembles the outcome of ksiva. For this reason, Nishmas Avram rules that printing is biblically prohibited, and therefore, unless it will adversely affect patient safety and care, that's to say, a delay in printing would adversely affect patient safety or care. Amir Lenacher, asking a non-Jewish colleague who is not Shabbos obligated, to print the document would be required and would be highly recommended. If there isn't time to have a non-Jewish colleague help with the printing, Nishmas Avram recommends using one's knuckle to press print, which is kind of an attempt at using a shinei in this sort of way. It is worth noting, however, that Moshe Feinstein is more lenient in this regard. He rules that printing is not comparable to normative ksiva, as when one does print, one more accurately causes writing to occur rather than writing with one's own force per se, which is what he posits as the real normative way to do this malacha. So due to this nuance, Rav Moshe and Tchumen rules that printing would be a derabanan, which would make printing much less problematic for patient care adjacent needs. But most modern halachic authorities rule, in fact, that printing on Shabbos isn't probably a deraisa and should be avoided if it won't adversely affect patient safety.
So just overall, in conclusion, to sum up everything we said, when doing a non-urgent or non-time sensitive task, there's a reasonable amount of time and it's not going to compromise patient care, it's always preferable to minimize the status of the malacha on Shabbos. So when you're documenting for patient care, electronic writing or typing and doing so with a shinoi is by far the best option halachically. When that's not possible, the next best thing is using the disappearing ink pens, with also doing using your non-dominant hand or one or the other if you need, followed by just using a regular pen with your non-dominant hand, followed by using a non-permanent pen with one's dominant hand. Printing on Shabbos is very problematic, and it's really best to ask a non-Shabbos obliged colleague for assistance. Unless, again, this is going to compromise patient care. And so that should also, there's going to be a lot of the things we talked about today are really going to be common themes of minimizing isser and using a shinoi. And again, it's important that this does not compromise patient care. And so we hope you enjoy this. We hope to bring you many more of these sessions. And you're always free to get a sneak peek by just reading the book itself, but we know sometimes the audio content's a little bit easier to digest. Thanks for joining.